Hello, my name is Sandra Smith, and this is my final presentation in professional ethics. For my final presentation, I selected to evaluate ethical leadership under pressure in Starbucks 2018 racial bias crisis. As a point of disclosure, I was actually not aware of this incident and Starbucks' response at the time that it occurred. So it was really fascinating to examine it with the lens of ethical leadership that I have been learning about in the course and in the textbook. Additionally, I'd like to share that I am not a very frequent Starbucks customer nowadays. I used to be a much more uh, enthusiastic coffee drinker, but I've actually changed my caffeine intake to mainly energy drinks nowadays. Not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I'm not much of a Starbucks customer nowadays. So, the inciting incident for this crisis occurred on April 12th, 2018, when two black men, Rashawn Nelson and Dante Robinson, visited a Starbucks store in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The two men had plans to meet with a third man to have a casual business meeting at the Starbucks location. After arriving to the Starbucks, one of the men asked the manager if they could use the restroom, and the manager denied them on the basis that they hadn't made a purchase at the time. The two men accepted this outcome and quietly had a seat in the Starbucks cafe to wait for the third man to arrive so they could commence their business meeting. Very shortly after the two men sat down, the manager approached them and asked them to leave the Starbucks cafe, which was pretty startling to the two men because there had been no indication that they had done anything wrong and they were simply quietly waiting for the third man to arrive. So, quite understandably, they informed the manager that they would not be leaving the Starbucks location. At which time, the manager made the decision to call the police, who arrived on scene to respond to the incident, spoke to the two men, and subsequently arrested them, charging them initially with trespassing before holding them for 8 hours and then releasing them without charges. Very, very traumatic circumstance to go through. And it really it was a circumstance that was quite escalated quite quickly from these two men arriving to Starbucks to being escorted out in handcuffs. So here are some contextual points that are important for understanding this circumstance. At the time, Starbucks had inconsistent policies regarding the use of restrooms and the seating areas in their cafes across some of their 8,000 plus store locations. And so these inconsistent policies really opened the door to discretionary enforcement based on the biases of their managers. So that really created an environment where, from one Starbucks to another, the policies would be inconsistently enforced. Additionally, this circumstance escalating quite quickly and rapidly to the call of law enforcement to respond to what was a very peaceful circumstance that is not uncommon in a retail environment where members of the public are interfacing all the time with the management and cafe staff really is quite fascinating, and I think set this case apart. In addition to social media amplifying engagement with and knowledge of this incident occurring. So I actually watched the video of the police interfacing with these two men, and even in the cell phone videos that were shot by other customers of the store, they were extremely cooperative, which, was very upsetting to the many thousands of people who saw that video and led to pretty rapid and quick response to the public boycotting Starbucks in the Philadelphia area. Now, I do remember this period of 2016, even into the pandemic, when it seemed as though the sharing of videos that were captured from much better cell phones and shared through new video sharing platforms, that this would be a really positive public good because incidents that may have only had awareness in a small local community could now be shared very rapidly across really the entire nation, which would, result in a lot greater stakeholder pressure and public pressure on the company to provide restitution and to respond to this inciting incident. So now on an examination of the company response. Within 3 days of the incident occurring on April 15th, 2018, Starbucks CEO Kevin Johnson responded quickly with a public apology that was released, all over social media and to the media, the traditional media, with a acknowledgement of the harm caused by this incident and a commitment to be part of the solution. So some of the action that Starbucks took was to develop a system-wide training that took place on May 29th, 2018, when Starbucks shuttered its 8,000 plus stores for one day for a racial bias training in which over 175,000 employees were trained. Another one of the more interesting responses that I noted was policy reform in the place of enacting a third place policy that instituted open restrooms and seating to non-purchasing guests. In my experience with Starbucks, it's pretty obvious that it has been functioning as a third place within our society for a very, very long time. Starbucks was one of the first companies to provide public Wi-Fi within its cafes long before it was a common business practice, and that brought people wanting to work and meet in their cafes. That was a pretty common occurrence in Starbucks in my life experience. Additionally, Starbucks is open very, very early and tends to be open later. And so that gives more members of the public an opportunity to utilize it as a third place. So it just makes sense, common sense for me, for this policy to be enacted where members of the public can utilize their restrooms and their space. It's just common sense with their business model, in my opinion. However, this policy was not instituted at the time, which would have essentially completely stopped this incident and its escalation from occurring. Additionally, with the city of Philadelphia, each man received a city-funded grant for a youth entrepreneurship program. And so this was piece of action that was taken after CEO Johnson met with the two men who were arrested. And so it was very important for them that Starbucks actually showed up financially to respond and to seed funds into the community that was affected, i.e., the Black community in Philadelphia. Additionally, there was ASU tuition support reported by some media outlets in the immediate aftermath. To examine Starbucks' responses from the lens of ethical leadership, you have a few important pieces that come into play. Firstly, the stakeholder theory. Starbucks's immediate response prioritized community trust and employee development over short-term profit loss, which that one day of shuttering operations did affect their profit margins, albeit probably pretty marginally, but that is of note here. CEO Johnson's visible engagement, he made the decision to meet with the men who were arrested, to hear from them, to hear how they were affected, and to also communicate directly with employees and customers and the public was really an important note here. Additionally, Starbucks leadership consulted with diversity experts to maintain stability by showing commitment beyond shareholders to a broad range of stakeholders. Additionally, deontological ethics really come into play from this circumstance. From a duty-based perspective, Starbucks leadership had an ethical responsibility to protect the inherent dignity and rights of customers and employees, regardless of financial or reputational loss. Deontological ethics emphasizes that leaders should act according to principles of fairness and non-discrimination, even when those actions may result in short-term losses or challenges for the organization. So really the dilemma at stake here was about Starbucks policies not uplifting and upholding the inherent dignity of their customers by having this inconsistent restroom policy that opened the door toward individual biases of managers coming into play, causing the conflict that resulted in this ethical and public dilemma. Additionally, I read a scholarly analysis that put forth this term rhetoric of renewal. The argument was that Starbucks had engaged not only in short-term image repair, but had gone beyond that to focus on, how the organization would consistently learn and grow. In this again, this visible leadership engagement comes into play here by the fact that Starbucks leadership had acknowledged the harm that they had uh, enacted in this circumstance and that their policies had allowed to occur, and to commit to systemic changes through training and policy reform, and to continue to have these difficult conversations. Here are two elements of critique that I noted from my scholarly research. That there is a limitation to one-day training that has been well documented in research, which shows that, brief anti-bias training often lacks the long-term impact necessary to have ongoing structures of accountability to avoid these kinds of circumstances from occurring in the future. Additionally, there is a large risk of symbolic action here, that without sustained structural change, highly visible responses may be perceived as symbolic gestures rather than genuine ethical reform. And the Black community in America, having faced a lot of discrimination and business practices that do not uphold their dignity, they really have a uh, intuition and instinct toward these kind of symbolic actions being taken by companies, because so often they will fade away very quickly after being taken once, the public response has calmed down and their risk of boycott is mitigated. So those critiques actually bear out, as we'll discuss in a future slide. So here's my evaluation of the effective damage control and mitigation. One of the really key pieces here is that Starbucks had stakeholder-centered credibility that really assisted them in mitigating and providing damage control in response to this crisis. Starbucks' strong ties with employees and customers gave them credibility to its renewal messaging. Starbucks seems to have a kind of different place in a lot of people's perception than other franchise fast food stores, even though that's pretty much what they are. And so, because of that, and likely because so many people have utilized Starbucks as a third space, Starbucks was able to really bank on this strong credibility in responding. Additionally, the expert involvement of engaging diversity experts and holding space for uncomfortable conversations happening among their staff really helped them uh, mitigate the damage here. And the Starbucks model was openness and signaled a commitment to ongoing learning and systemic change at the time. Here are some of the limitations and unintended consequences to Starbucks' action in the immediate aftermath of the crisis. Uh, there's some limited research that suggested that foot traffic and in-store dynamics changed after the third place policy was put into effect. Again, I don't lend a lot of credence to that. I think Starbucks has always acted as a third place. And so I highly doubt that too much changed within their cafes following this, but there is some limited research that indicates that. And additionally, I think this is the biggest limitation on Starbucks action. In January of 2025, Starbucks reversed the open door policy, which put back into place a requirement of a purchase in order for members of the public to use the restroom via a new code of conduct. And I think that's raised some serious questions about how permanent the earlier ethical stance was and what ethical leadership means amid evolving conditions. And we'll discuss some of those evolving conditions here shortly. So my evaluation of Starbucks' response is mixed. The strengths are pretty clear. There was a swift ownership from the highest executive that involved apology, ownership, and commitment to improve. Additionally, they pretty swiftly organized this large-scale training effort and institution structural policy change. I think the most meaningful piece of ethical response was the restorative community involvement. Starbucks actually financially investing in the community that they had harmed, the Black community in Philadelphia. That was probably the most meaningful piece of ethical response, in my opinion. So these align with ethical leadership best practices to act quickly, own harm, and change systems. The weaknesses is again an over-reliance on a one-day training, especially for a topic as complex and sprawling as racial bias and systemic racism in our country and in the business place was insufficient. And so I don't see that one-day training as being particularly impactful. And most importantly, in my view, the sustainability of the reforms being mixed, and then some of these policy changes and reforms being uh, completely rescinded, as in the third place policy being rescinded, that really indicates that some of the actions Starbucks may have taken, while not in alignment with its values, is really more about winning the public trust, minimizing the possibility of a boycott. And so that is a piece that really doesn't sit well with me. Here would be my recommendations for Starbucks. To really institutionalize learning surrounding DEI, racial bias, and cultural sensitivity and culture humility, replacing these one-off trainings with ongoing metrics and accountability. DEI, even in my career, I have had to take some significant action in recent months to change any and all DEI language because of the new presidential administration. And so if creativity is needed in this current political season to ensure that the curriculum is viable, so that would probably need to be taking place here as well. Additionally, codifying equitable service standards, consistent policies across all stores with auditing, because you have to audit to ensure that policies are being adhered to prevent discretion-based bias. Community partnership is really, really key here to elicit the feedback and the ongoing counsel of the community that this incident affected, i.e., the Black community in Philadelphia. So, to establish advisory boards is a great way of doing that for co-designing equity strategies. This is one that I added from my professional experience, nonviolent crisis intervention training. As I mentioned, there was a very steep escalation here, and there were several points in which the manager could have utilized NVCI skills to create space between responding to these two customers and calling the police, as I mentioned, which is a very dangerous and traumatic circumstance. So to for Starbucks not just to train on racial sensitivity and bias, but to equip their managers and front-facing staff members with verbal de-escalation techniques, so that there'd be a lot more space between, a conflict or crisis occurring with a customer or a member of the public in the store to the police being called, which should really be an action of last resort. Here's my conclusion. Starbucks showed textbook ethical leadership in 2018, owning harm and changing systems, but enduring ethical leadership requires durable structures. The 2025 rollback is a reminder that ethical policies must be sustainable in practice, not just principled in crisis. As currently, this circumstance could very easily happen again in a Starbucks store because the third place policy has been revealed. That really is called into question for me. Ethical leadership is not a one-time event. It must be ongoing. These are the scholarly articles that I cited and used for the development of my presentation. Thank you very much. I have appreciated this opportunity, and I hope you have a wonderful day.